Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra 8 months later. In this video, I'm going to give you my experience after using this phone for over 8 months at this point. There's been a lot of great things about this device that have actually made me consider switching for the first time in over 10 years from iPhone to Android. But there's still a lot of things, well, maybe not a lot, but some things that I didn't really like about this phone and that I'm going to comment in this video. As always, let's begin by talking about the exterior design, which is probably the least surprising thing about this phone because it is almost identical to the previous S23 and S22 Ultra. I think the only difference is that the side bezels are now a little bit flatter as opposed to those previous models, which on paper makes the phone a little bit more comfortable to hold, but I think that comes down to personal preference. In my opinion, I think this is great. I like it over those older phones, but I've also seen a lot of people say that this new design is less ergonomic and that they prefer the rounded edges, so yeah, it's all about personal preference. Besides that, I'm not mad that they kept the design from those other devices because I actually think it's really good looking. Maybe I'm not the biggest fan of the 90-degree angled corners, and I've said this in other videos, but besides that, in terms of the way the phone looks, I think it is absolutely stunning. It has this very simple and elegant industrial design that just looks good, and it's been around now for over 3 years, which is the proof that people like it. If Samsung saw people criticizing it, they would change it. So yeah, it seems like me and most people seem to like this new design. Not that it should matter. If you don't like it, you don't like it. It's about personal preference. But yeah, most people, me included, find this design very good looking and very good feeling. This is probably the best feeling matte glass I've ever touched in any device I've ever had. And this is very subtle. This is a very little detail, but when you're spending so much money on a phone, you actually pay attention to these details. So the matte glass on the iPhones and on the cheaper S24 is actually a little rougher as opposed to the S24 Ultra, which is super smooth, which to be fair is probably not the best thing in terms of ergonomics because it's going to slip out of your hand with relative ease. But when it comes to the way it feels in your fingers and your hand, it is incredible. It feels very premium. It feels like it's worth the money it costs, which is a lot of money. Oh, and by the way, before we move on, as always, I left Amazon links for this phone down below in the description with the best prices that I found. So if you're interested on getting it or taking a look, at the end of the video, remember you have the links. But anyways, that being said, let's move on with the processor, the internal components on this phone, which, as you probably guessed, are the best of the best on any Android phone available right now. It has the Snapdragon 8 Generation 3 optimized for Samsung to get a little bit extra performance, and it has 12 gigabytes of RAM. So yeah, the experience navigating around the system and the apps, it's super smooth, super reliable. I actually remember when not that long ago, iPhones felt way smoother and way more reliable, so to say, than Android phones, especially Samsung phones, because of their launcher. And I'm not really sure what's happened in the past 4 to 5 years, but Samsung has caught on to the iPhone and in a lot of ways has even surpassed it, especially considering how buggy the new iOS 18 is, but that's a topic for another video. Now, of course, because it has 12 gigabytes of RAM, most apps are going to stay opened in the background, so it almost feels like you don't have to load them anymore. If you use the typical apps like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and you don't do much more with your phone, you're likely to not ever have to load an app ever again, unless it's a random app you open from time to time, which makes the experience even better. Now, when it comes to gaming, I have noticed a little flaw with this phone, although, well, to be fair, it is a flaw most high-end phones have. If you play casual games like this, like Subway Surfers, or even Call of Duty or Asphalt 9, the typical casual phone games, it is actually going to give you an amazing experience, and the phone is not going to warm up at all. Like, it feels like you're not doing anything with the phone. It's really impressive. But if you start playing a game that lets you get high graphics and high resolutions and high frame rates, it seems like the phone has a really hard time maintaining temperatures when that happens. I think it's because it doesn't have any kind of active cooling. So if it gets warm, there is actually no way for it to get cool unless you stop playing the game and you delete it from the multitasking. But yeah, I've had a really tough experience playing games like Genshin Impact because the phone just keeps getting warmer and warmer and warmer until it's really difficult to have it in your hand because it almost burns. As I said, this happens with most Android phones and iPhones, to be fair. Like every game that plays Genshin Impact in ultra settings is going to get incredibly hot. But yeah, considering the price of the device, I think this is something they should be working on for the future for the S25 Ultra or S26 Ultra so it doesn't happen anymore. Because when you're spending so much money on a device, those kinds of things, kind of catch you off guard. They are not what we could consider a premium experience. So yeah, if they can fix that in the future, that would be great. Now, as I said earlier, the phone works incredibly well when navigating around apps and moving around the system. That's partially because of the operating system. As you can see, it's running on Android 14 with One UI 6.1 as the launcher. And this is probably the best and most optimized combination I've seen on any Android phone so far, if we exclude, of course, Google Pixels with native Android. But yeah, it is incredibly smooth. Now, as a little update, Android 15 has just come out and it's going to start rolling out to some selected Android phones. And I think the S24 Ultra is one of those phones. But anyways, that being said, let's move on to what I consider to be the best component on the S24 Ultra, the battery. This is something I rarely see anybody talking about, but yes, the S24 Ultra has probably the best battery on any top-tier smartphone right now. In fact, I recently saw a battery comparison made by Mr. Who's the Boss, where he compared all the new iPhones to the S24 Ultra, and the S24 Ultra was better, as opposed to the iPhone 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max, which are incredibly good when it comes to battery life. So yeah, if you have an S24 Ultra, you probably know. But for those of you who still want to get it or are looking into getting one, yes, this phone has insane battery life. It lasts, if you're not a demanding user, it can last you 2 to 3 days. And if you're like a heavy-duty gamer that plays games with your phone and edits videos or does demanding things, it is almost impossible to get under a day of usage with this phone. And I say this because I've done some heavy-duty testing and for some videos with this phone, and never have I ever run out of battery with this device. In fact, as you can see, now it's at 6% battery life. This is after over a week of the phone being turned on. Now, to be fair, I am not using it as my personal device right now. I'm barely using it at this point. But yeah, this is over a week of usage. Now, probably one of the most important components on the S24 Ultra are the cameras, which, as you can see, look almost identical to the ones on the S23 Ultra. And that's because they are very similar to those older cameras. They are not the same, but they are very similar. We still have a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. We have a 200 megapixel main sensor, which is kind of a hit or miss. Sometimes you do notice those 200 megapixels, sometimes you don't. Then we get a 3x telephoto, which we had last year. And then we have a 5x telephoto with 50 megapixels. This is probably the most controversial camera on the device because we come from a 10x telephoto, and people were kind of surprised that Samsung decided to reduce the amount of zoom, which feels almost like a downgrade over the past model. But when you look closer into it, you realize that the old 10x camera was less quality, smaller, and it only had 10 megapixels. So you can now get much better 5x telephoto pictures with this phone, and you can get better 10x telephoto pictures with this phone because it has 5 times the amount of resolution. So even if you zoom in on the image to get that 10x, you are still going to have more detail. And because the sensor and the optics are better, the result, and I've seen a lot of tests, I can tell you from experience, it actually is a better picture than the one you would take on an S23 Ultra. Now, probably the most impressive feature on the S24 Ultra is that it can take 200 megapixel pictures, which, as I said, is kind of a hit or miss because sometimes you do notice a really big difference and they end up being really impressive, and some other times they actually look almost identical. This is a picture of my dog that I took at midday in a cloudy day, so lighting conditions were very favorable and the phone was capable of taking full advantage of all those extra pixels. As you can see, it is a normal picture. It doesn't seem special when you look at it at first glance, but when you start zooming in, it is almost like the phone doesn't ever get blurry. The picture doesn't ever lose any quality to the point where you can zoom in more and more and more and see the individual details on the nose of my dog. You can see the saliva bubbles forming under his tongue. I can't explain how insanely impressive this is coming from a phone camera, which is a very tiny camera. This is absolutely impressive. You can even see the individual hairs under the lip. If you start looking for details, it's really remarkable. Like, you can see individual hairs. You can see you can see me in the reflection of his eye, which, when considering the picture is this, it's a very, very wide angle picture of my dog and a lot of external area. There's not a lot of detail. It's not a close-up, but you can turn it into a close-up if you want. It is really, really impressive. The problem here is that, as I said earlier, if lighting conditions are not perfect or you make a slight movement when taking a picture, that's enough of a reason for those extra details to get lost. You probably are not going to be able to distinguish, but this picture doesn't have any extra detail as opposed to a normal 12 megapixel photo. Although it was taken with 200 megapixels and it occupies like 60 megabytes of space. Now, to be fair, what ends up happening most of the time is that you end at a sort of like middle ground where maybe it is not as impressive as my dog picture I showed earlier, but it is also not as blurry as a 12 megapixel photo. It ends up being like a in between, which can justify the extra space of 200 megapixel photos, especially if it's an important moment and you want to capture it with as much detail as possible. In fact, what I usually recommend is that you hover in between both options. If you want to take a casual picture at something that doesn't really matter, just use the 12 megapixel mode. And if you want to capture something really important, then switch to 50 or 200 megapixels for maximum quality. Now, that being said, we are at a very important moment because the S25 Ultra is only a couple months away. So for anybody looking to get this phone, I think it's starting to be a good idea to wait, maybe not get it now, delay that gratification, because we never know how good or how bad that other phone is going to be. And even then, if it ends up being a bad phone and you want to keep the S24 Ultra, you'll probably be able to get it at a lower price. So it is always a good idea around September, October, November to maybe just wait a little longer for the next Galaxy phone in the lineup. That being said, as I said earlier, there are links for the S24 Ultra down below in the description, just in case you can't wait those extra 2 months and you want to get it now. But also, for those of you who can hold the money in your wallet, I also left a link with the best deals on Amazon available today. So the best discounts, the best deals that I found on the entire platform. So if you're curious on what kinds of deals you can find there, as I said, you have a link down below in the description. And now that the video is about to end, I recommend you go take a look.